like get your thing ready there, and I'll do like an introduction,
Yep.
just like a brief overview. Let's see. Oh,
Can
looks
you
like
can you see my slides?
not yet, no.
Oh, really? Because I'm sharing my screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. No, I think let's see my spacing out where it's yeah, mapping and migrating farm workers exposure to heat.
Yep,
Okay, sorry. I'm spacing out.
that's fine.
Okay. Oh, looks like we even have some brasileños da Amazônia.
Ah,
Yeah.
que ótimo.
Você vai ser famoso.
Hi,
Hi, David. Hi, Trent.
You remember
It's
Cleo?
Cleo. I don't know why
Cleo. Tudo
it's not
bom?
possible I turn on my camera.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So let me bueno, voy a hacer una pues introducción, bueno, un poquito de semblanza. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Nada más para, a ver, organizarme un poquito. Pues les quiero presentar a Trent Big, que es profesor en el Departamento de Geografía en San Diego State, en San Diego, California. Ya, pues creo que desde hace muchos años. Trent hizo su maestría y su doctorado en el Departamento de Geografía en la Universidad de Santa Bárbara, bueno, también en California. Y pues ya lleva mucho tiempo, pues, trabajando con, trabajando con cuestiones de, pues, hidrológicas, meteorológicas. En particular, ha trabajado mucho en la región amazónica. Y pues también, pues en los últimos años creo que ha trabajado mucho en la cuestión frontera entre Estados Unidos y México. Y pues tiene pues muchas publicaciones, alumnos graduados, postdocs, etcétera. Y pues creo que pues entiende bien el español, pero va a dar la charla en inglés. Y pues si quieren hacer preguntas en inglés o en portugués, no hay problema. Podemos traducir si hace falta. Okay. Bueno, okay. Well, welcome, Trent. Thanks for taking the offer of doing the seminar. I think it's going to be very interesting. So whenever you'd like to begin. Yeah, whenever you'd like to begin.
Trent, I think you are muted.
How's that?
Yeah, buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por la invitación, pero yo voy a presentar en inglés. Disculpa. Disculpa, portugués. So my apologies, I'll present in English. So thanks so much for the opportunity. I'm very pleased to present this work on that I've been doing in collaboration with people from public health and mathematics and statistics on mapping and mitigating farm worker exposure to heat. And this is a project funded by the University of California Office of the President. And it's a very short 2-year project, but we're very fortunate to have wonderful partners with the University of California at Santa Barbara and from especially our community partner, Líderes Campesinas, who advocates on behalf of farm workers, and they're helping us with a lot of the field work and community collaboration. So just a little background, there's approximately 2 million farm workers on an annual basis in the United States. They're 20 to 35 times more likely to die from heat than other workers. Between 2005 and 2021, heat was responsible for 151 farm worker deaths. And farm workers have a higher injury rate, lower productivity, and kidney disease when exposed to high heat stress. So, and of course, with global climate change, this is likely to become much more acute of a problem. The heat illness rates are highest within California in the Imperial Valley, which is in the southeastern part of the state. And over 2000 to 2017, there's a rate of more than 35 heat-related illnesses per 100,000 workers in Southern California. And here's a satellite image showing the Salton Sea and the Imperial Valley to the south and the Coachella Valley to the north. And so within California, the Imperial Valley is a hot spot of particularly high temperatures and high heat related illness rates. So this is why we wanted to focus on this area. Another dimension to this problem is that the inflow to the Imperial Valley has decreased from 1995 to the year 2020. The top line is the canal inflow to the Imperial Valley. It's decreased by 15 to 20% since 1995 because that water is being shipped to San Diego for its use. That's resulted in a decrease of evapotranspiration and decrease of flow into the Salton Sea. And this has implications for heat stress because evapotranspiration cools the land surface, but it also adds humidity. And so we wanted to understand how the heat stress differs between unirrigated and irrigated landscapes and how that might change into the future. So that's how I got involved in this as a hydrologist. By training, I'm a hydrologist with a degree in geography. So I started looking at this problem from the standpoint of hydrology, but then realized that there are important implications for heat stress and for farm worker well-being. And so changes in water use can impact the near surface climate by increasing the albedo and increasing reflectivity, lowering evapotranspiration, but also leading to higher temperatures and lower humidity. And this is a screenshot, Google Earth screenshot of a fallow field to the north and cultivated fields to the south. So as the Imperial Valley starts to use less water and we imagine having more fallowed areas, what will that do to the heat stress? Our goal in this project was to have a swift and measurable impact on climate resilience in California. So this was a special one-time allocation, and it's a real interesting challenge for academics, for us in academia, to see an immediate application of our work to solve a both climate and social problem. So our objective in this project is to map spatial and temporal trends in rural heat indices, to measure heat stress in the field on the farm workers themselves, and to co-produce knowledge on heat stress exposure and how to disseminate and make an impact for the farm working community in Imperial Valley. So this is a very interdisciplinary project with students and faculty from geography, environmental health, math, and statistics, as well as both at SDSU and the University of California. University of California Cooperative Extension, Ali Montazar, has been instrumental in helping us make measurements in the field. And then we have a lot of collaborators with Lideris Campesinas, and I have Ana Soloria and Brandon Toji represented here. So very interdisciplinary kind of project. And we have 6 activities. The first one is mapping hotspots and trends. So where is air temperature first, land surface temperature, LST, and air temperature high in the valley. So air temperature and climate and heat indices we'll get from the WRF climate model. Land surface temperature is at higher spatial resolution from the MODIS land surface temperature product. That gives us a hotspot mapping and trend analysis. Activity 2 is to explore the connections between cropping type and heat stress. So we're using higher resolution satellite imagery for that, Landsat EcoStress at 30 and 70 meters. And then we have crop data that we are feeding into to analyze those land surface temperature data to understand how crop type interacts with land surface temperature and heat stress. In particular, we have one of our critical parameters is called rest minutes. So how many rest minutes should farm workers be getting for a given crop and a given time of year? And then activity 3 is a farm worker heat assessment. That's the public health folks who are doing both in community surveys and in situ air and body temperature sensors that allow us to understand what is their physiological stress and what's their perceptions of that. And then activity 4 is an integration of those mapping and heat assessment activities to develop a predictive model of where physiological stress is likely to be high. Activity 5, then we visualize all that in a web tool and now an app. And then activity 6 is implementing that app web visualization tool and getting feedback from the community on it. So I'm going to touch on each of these activities very quickly, very briefly, in the interest of time. So we want to know what are the spatiotemporal trends in heat stress, when and where are farm workers exposed to heat? Are there differences by crops? What's the impact of irrigation? What's the impact of heat or calculated heat indices on rest breaks? What are the farm worker perceptions of heat, and what type of data is most useful for mitigating heat stress, and how can we disseminate it? So the gold standard heat metric or heat index is the wet bulb globe temperature. And it's composed of 3 components. Dry bulb temperature, or also known as just regular air temperature, that we're all most familiar with probably. The natural wet bulb temperature, which is simulates the cooling effect of sweat, and is the temperature of a thermometer that's kept wet. So you have a thermometer resting on a wet surface, and the wet bulb temperature is the temperature of that bulb that is constantly cooling off through evapotranspiration. And then the black globe temperature is a thermometer that's inside of a black copper sphere. And that simulates the impact of solar radiation. So you'll notice that the weighting of these different components is perhaps different than we might expect. Air temperature only receives 10% of the weight of the wet bulb globe temperature, suggesting that air temperature is actually a very small component of the wet bulb globe temperature and of the experience of the human body, the experience of heat by the human body. 70% is this wet bulb temperature. So that incorporates the impact of relative humidity and air temperature. So the higher the humidity, the less less water will evaporate, the less the cooling rate on the thermometer. So as humidity increases, the wet bulb temperature will increase. And then the black globe temperature gets a 20% weighting. So integrating these 3 components is really important for understanding the human physiological experience of heat. And then those WGBT thresholds, or there have been established WGBT thresholds that are suggested by the National Weather Service, this agency, National Weather Service, where you get 15 rest minutes per hour if the wet bulb globe temperature is between 80 and 85 Fahrenheit, 30 minutes of rest if it's 85 to 88, 40 minutes if it's 88 to 90, and 45 minutes per hour if the wet bulb globe temperature is greater than 90. So I'm going to be presenting maps that will show these in the same colors as their regulatory regulatory mandates. The CCR is the California Code of Regulation. It is sort of surprisingly enough based only on air temperature, which remember is only 10% of the weighting of the wet bulb globe temperature. And if the air temperature is above 95, you get an extra 5 minutes per hour. Doesn't matter if it's 110, 120, which it commonly reach in the Imperial Valley, still get 5 minutes an hour. And then the federal OSHA, which was proposed at the time of during Joe Biden's administration, set it's a heat index that includes relative humidity and temperature, so it's a little closer to wet bulb, but they have a single threshold that gives you 7.5 minutes. So we really wanted to compare the impact of these regulatory thresholds and indices, choice of indices in the rest minutes per hour. Also note that these thresholds are based on young, healthy soldiers in the US Army, where these experiments were done in the 1950s under low to moderate exertion rates. And we anticipate that farm workers might have much, they're often not in their 20s. They're often complicating health conditions, and they're often not doing just low to moderate exertion. So first, what are the spatial temporal trends in heat stress? For the critical days in June, July, and August, the wet bulb globe pinch temperature is greater than the first regulatory threshold, basically 100% of the time. And that's on the left side here is showing the percentage of time that each individual cell in this climate model had a wet bulb globe temperature greater than 80 degrees Fahrenheit. On the right panel is when wet bulb globe temperature is greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit, where you get 45 minutes of rest an hour, according to the National Weather Service. During June, July, and August, 60 to 70% of days had wet bulb globe temperature greater than 90. So wet bulb globe temperature exceeds the regulatory threshold on basically every day, the lowest regulatory threshold basically every day in June, July, and August, and exceeds the highest threshold more than half the time. And then the other key component here is that there is a trend in the number of days of exceedance per decade. So each cell here represents the number of days of increase in the number of days per decade where the wet bulb globe temperature is greater than 80 or 90. And it's really those extreme high values greater than 90 degrees Fahrenheit where we're seeing the biggest increase in frequency, up to 5 to 6 days per decade increase in the frequency of high heat stress. So WGBT exceeds the threshold for most days in June, July, and August, and it's increasing. I am going to skip this part and go straight to the next question, which is when and where are farm workers exposed to heat? One of the things that we found is that the work shift, both the month and the time of day, is critical. I mean, it seems obvious in retrospect, but there's a lot more flexibility in the working calendar than we had initially anticipated. So some crops you can harvest at night, onions, carrots, sometimes grapes, and others you have to harvest during the day, like dates. And so this is some pictures showing overhead illumination using stadium lights, where you can conceivably shift the harvesting to nighttime, but dates you can't do that. The illumination geometry is too complicated, and you have to harvest during the day. So it's really these summertime, daytime obligate crops that we suspect are going to have the highest heat stress. So what we can do is, with our climate model results, is show on the x-axis here is the dates. So starting in April, May, June, July through October, sort of one of the main heat stress months. And on the y-axis is the hours of the day. So onions, for example, are harvested between May and the end of June at night. And so So they have the colors then correspond to those WGBT exceedance thresholds. So greater than 80 is yellow, greater than 90 is in magenta. And so onions, we don't think there's going to be a lot of heat stress in onions because they're harvested at night, even despite the fact that they're harvested in May and June. Grapes, on the other hand, harvested during the daytime in May and June. Carrots, they're harvested early enough, even though they're harvested during the day. Probably not, on average, a big heat stress problem. But in the summertime, there is land preparation associated with carrots and several other crops, and those workers could be exposed to extreme heat. And then here's dates showing the harvest dates that correspond to August, but also during the daytime. So these are like we're honing in on what are the most important crops to focus on. Excuse me, my own cell phone went off. So that's one of our core conclusions here, is that the crop type and the cropping calendar are really determine the heat risk exposure. So we also are using that land surface temperature data to map the heat, at least the land surface temperature at very high spatial resolution. And we do see a difference in about 13 degrees centigrade between, in this case, small grains, small vegetables, and fallow fields, and some areas that are in land preparation. So there's a real big difference between vegetated fields and fallow fields. So it's those, we are tentatively concluding that farmers involved in land prep are really exposed to high heat. I'm going to skip this for a second. And so I mentioned at the very beginning that irrigation might have an impact on wet bulb globe temperature. And through our climate model simulations, we found that daytime WGBT decreases when you irrigate because the air temperature decreases more than the wet bulb globe temperature increases. But at nighttime, you actually increase the wet bulb globe temperature. So that raises a concern that with more irrigation, you increase the nighttime wet globe temperature. If you fallow more, you could increase the daytime wet bulb globe temperature. So we'll have to be sensitive to, again, how the sort of basin scale water balance feeds in on the near surface climate. This is an example of the policy implications of different heat metrics for the amount of rest minutes. How much rest time should workers get due to heat stress? And on the left is the state of California's recommendation for the number of rest minutes per hour. It's about 3 this is April to October of 2020. On average, workers would get 3 minutes per hour per day from April to October due to heat. On the right is the WGBT realization of this, where the workers should be getting on average between 9 and 15 minutes. And so the take-home message is that your choice of metric, whether it's especially dry bulb temperature, and the use of one single threshold at 95 degrees Fahrenheit is likely not protective of farm workers, especially when compared with the physiologically based wet bulb globe temperature index that results in a much higher recommended rest minutes. I mentioned the in situ measurements that we're doing to confirm when and where farm workers are experiencing heat stress. And to date, we've got little more than 100 participants evaluated. I think we might be up to close to 150 now. This is work being done entirely by the public health people, and the workers are instrumented with a sort of halter top kind of apparatus that measures their skin temperature and their heart rate. And at the same time, we deploy a WGBT sensor in the field and eye buttons at the home to monitor the nighttime conditions. And this is kind of what that looks like in the field. Here's a WGBT sensor, and then a worker being instrumented with the halter top. And so I'm going to skip to how we calculate the physiological stress. It's the difference between your resting temperature and the skin temperature at time t. And don't worry about the constants, but the idea is that you measure both the skin temperature and the heart rate at resting, which is the subscript 0 here. And then it's the difference between that and the heart rate at a given time, with a few constants uh, added in. And then greater than a PSI greater than 6 is not good for the farm worker. And so here's what the field data, some preliminary field data look like from July. And the x-axis is time starting at 6 a.m. going to 1 p.m. And on y-axis on the left panel is skin temperature. And so the skin temperature at rest is about 34 degrees Celsius and increases to 30, almost 40 degrees, which is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, by the end of the workday. And so one take-home message here is that the skin temperature just keeps increasing throughout the day, and does not recover during rest breaks, which are indicated by the red dots here. So they have a lunch break, but their skin temperature decreases a little bit, but not nearly back to the resting rate. Same thing with heart rate. Heart rate's a little bit more variable, but there are long-term or trends throughout the day towards overall higher heart rate as the farm worker continues to experience the stress. And so this is the on the left panel, just focus on the left panel, 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. This shows the physiological stress index, and by the end of the workday, it's well above that critical value of 6. And so we're demonstrating that that the farm workers are exposed to high physiological stress index, and that breaks don't necessarily bring them back to baseline. The right panel is showing the work hours when the farm worker was actually in the field working. So next, we're going to test for the statistical relationship between the WGBT, this black line on the right panel, and the PSI measured physiological stress measured in the field to determine, can we turn our climate models of WGBT into a map of PSI, a map of the physiological heat stress that farmers are experiencing. So the next sort of big question is, what do farm workers feel about the heat? What are their experiences? And these are, this are some sort of take-home messages that we've gotten from our interviews with the farm workers. So the first one is that they access climate information using their cell phones. So almost all the workers that we have interviewed so far have smartphones, and they use it to access information about the weather. They also base it just on, they go outside in the morning and see what it feels like and get a quality, sort of more sort of personal perception of what the heat is going to be like that day. They get very limited communication from their employers about when it's going to be hot. Their managers, the direct field managers, are really the critical decision makers for reducing their hours to heat. The farmer workers we talked to have not received formal trainings in heat illness prevention, and they learned about the symptoms, to seek water and shade very informally from conversations with one another and with managers. So fortunately, most of them have air conditioning at home, allowing them to recuperate at night, but our eye buttons will tell us if the air temperature actually gets down low enough, because air conditioning is expensive, and we anticipate that some units may not be right-sized for the dwellings. So we're still analyzing those data. One theme that emerged from our qualitative interviews was that a lot of farm workers are feeling mental stress in addition to physical stress because of the heat. They don't know, in part because the rules are not totally clear, if they will be allowed to stop work, if they should stop working, they might feel pressure to continue work. Fortunately, they have not reported feeling express pressure to miss breaks, to keep working through their breaks from their managers. The breaks are mandatory. Our physiological stress measurements suggest they may not be protective of their physiological stress. One very important point was that the workers have report that they have never seen anyone come and check on the regulations or the enforcement. So no one from the state, no one from the county, no one from the city, nobody besides their direct employer is not even the direct employer, but their direct manager for the day, the foreman or the mayordomo, is even aware of heat and potentially enforcing. So those managers, the field managers, make a call to end the workday after 6 hours. So typically the day starts at 6 a.m. for most of the daytime harvested crops and ends at 2, but they can call it and the farm workers will still get paid for those extra 2 hours if it's too hot. But those calls are made completely qualitatively and based on the mayordomo's sense of how the farm workers are feeling, which could be very important and valuable data. But we maintain and we hypothesize that those decisions could be more consistent and more protective if they're supported with quantitative WGBT information. And so now we're thinking about what kinds of data would be useful to be getting into the hands of the mayordomos. And we've done an evaluation of the forecast, and on the scatter plot, the x-axis is the California Irrigation Management Information System wet bulb globe temperature estimate, and the y-axis is the national blend of models from the national weather forecasting system. And for 4 different stations, pretty darn good, right? So we are very happy and confident that a 24-hour forecast of WGBT will be useful for workers and managers. And so we're moving ahead with that. We're not necessarily trying to improve that short-term forecast. We think it's ready to go. And I'm just going to skip to this. So there's some simple apps for phones, and there's one in particular that we are proposing to use. It's not this heat alert one. It's from the IAHA, the American Industrial Hygienists Association. And it has information, great information on what your clothing is, what your exertion rate is, what time of day you're going to be working, and what kinds of activities you should engage in to protect yourself from heat. So in conclusion, heat stress is an ongoing and growing problem in the Imperial Valley and in other places in the Western United States and the world. The policies proposed at the state level, the federal level, and by the National Weather Service differ very widely in their management recommendations. So there's not really a agreed upon standard or not agreed upon set of policy metrics that determine how many rest minutes farm workers should be getting. In particular, the current California Code of Regulations, we suspect, is probably not protective of farm workers, especially during high heat conditions. So our remote sensing analysis has showed some differences in land surface temperature by crop, between cropped areas and fallow areas. We need to now validate what that means for wet bulb globe temperature, because we'd love to turn our remote sensing maps of land surface temperature into remote sensing based maps of wet bulb globe temperature. But we're currently deploying some wet bulb globe temperature sensors in the field to quantify the relationship between land surface temperature and wet bulb globe temperature. So our in situ measurements on the workers themselves show evidence of heat stress through the physiological stress index, and we're working to predict those PSI values from climate models and perhaps from land surface temperature, because we're now able to correlate the PSI measurements that we get with the land surface temperature measurements made on the same day as the workers were working in the field. And so we're hoping and we're anticipating that there might be some predictability there. So in terms of practical management, again, our mandate from the state of California is to achieve actionable climate and ways to actively adapt to climate change and increased heat. And so practically speaking, the farm workers themselves and the mayordomos are really the key decision makers. Oversight by higher levels of government or even their own companies. So these are typically contracted farm workers and managers. But as far as we have observed, there appears to be minimal interaction with those higher up levels, and really the managers and the farm workers themselves are the key decision makers, which means that in this final point, very simple apps probably that can give timely information to managers on wet bulb globe temperature are, we think, probably going to be the most effective in adapting to high heat stress in the near term. So really empowering farm workers and managers themselves to say, yep, the wet bulb globe temperature is exceeding this value. Here's what our rest regimen should be. But field testing is needed, and that's one of our plans for this coming April and May, is to deploy the app in the field with a team of farm workers and assess their perception of its usability and how that might differ by farm worker age and other determinants of how comfortable they might be using the mobile technology. So yeah, that's the main part of my talk, and thanks all for listening, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions.
Okay, can you hear me, Trent?
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. So, pues si alguien tiene alguna pregunta o pues en el Zoom o en línea, creo que Joalyn me va a ayudar con eso también. Okay. Okay. So here's one from Simone. It's one of a former student, still friend and colleague to the day. Do you want me to read it in Portuguese to practice your Portuguese?
Sure.
Ok. O que tem sido feito localmente para amenizar o calor? Alguma área poder ser reflorestada?
Yeah. So the question is, how have measures been taken to reduce heat stress locally, in particular restoration and afforestation? That's been most pursued in the cities. So the cities do have tree planting programs, and that really does reduce the solar burden in the cities. The big problem out here is going to be water, right? So trees consume a lot of water, and there have to be some way to incentivize the farm owners to plant the trees. So that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the other scarce things, as you can see from these field photos, is shade. So they do bring out shade structures, but they're often much smaller than required to fit the farm workers underneath the shade structure. So that's one of the things that we're evaluating is how adequate are the shade structures, which are just like a sort of like a beach tarp that you would take to the beach. Some workers and some contractors do have refrigerate or air-conditioned mobile trucks where farmers can cool off if they're if they're experiencing heat stress. So we really need to, the adaptive measures have really been much more mechanical and much less about introducing more trees, I think probably because of the water use of the trees. Yeah, so thanks for that question.
Okay, from Ricardo Prieto. Very interesting talk. Thank you. Question. Do you have some thoughts about the effects of heat, not only on the workers, but on the plants and crops?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I don't know any much about the impacts of heat on the crops. I do know that they have already adapted their harvest schedule to harvest at night when the heat stress is less on the crops. So like the crops will start to wilt, especially lettuce crops would start to wilt during the daytime, but then at night they um, they're able to retain their turgor, their rigidity, and that's when they want to harvest. So one of the reasons they harvest at night is because the crops wilt during the day. But I don't, that's an excellent question. I wish I had a better answer about, for example, the impact of heat on yield. And I simply don't know the answer to that question. And if, you know, I'd love to collaborate with anybody who knows about plant physiology better than I do. So yeah, thank you. I think Jorge Zavala has a question in the chat.
Sí, muy interesante la plática, felicitaciones. Aunque está muy relacionada la radiación solar con la temperatura, sí me llama la atención que no la consideren porque realmente pues la experiencia que hemos tenido en México en algunos trabajos que se están haciendo es que es muy diferente tener la misma temperatura a la sombra que bajo la radiación solar. Probablemente es que casi no hay nubes por allá, pero bueno.
Yeah, I agree. Solar radiation is very important. And it's you raise a very important point. So in the current calculation of wet bulb globe temperature, black globe temperature, which is the only measurement that's made in the sun. So the air temperature and the wet bulb temperature are made in the shade. The one that's made in the sun is only receives 20% of the weight. I think that when we do our analysis of the physiological stress index, that we will probably end up giving black globe temperature and the solar radiation a higher weight because this 10, 70, 20, that is based on work that was done in the East Coast of the United States in North Carolina, where the solar radiation is not as intense as it is in Imperial Valley. And so I completely agree that I think the role of sunlight is probably underestimated in the current wet bulb globe temperature calculation. And we hope we'll have enough data to evaluate that.
Gracias.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. I'll do Simona and then Cleo. Okay, Simona, Simone, let's see. Qual é o maior síntoma relatado pelos agricultores? Pressão arterial alta?
Yeah. I don't know what the question is about what is the most common symptom of heat stress. in the farm workers. I mean, yeah, I wish I knew. And I don't want to make up anything, so I really don't know. I really don't know.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. I need to. I'll ask my public health people what the symptoms are. Thank you.
Okay. Cleo?
Hi, Trent. Very nice talk. Thanks a lot. I'm curious about two variables, VPD and Boyon ratio. Did you have time to see these variables, or is not important for your study?
Yeah, absolutely. So the VPD would vapor pressure deficit, which is the different. I'm just saying it from my own for me to remember, is the difference between the saturation vapor pressure and the actual vapor pressure. So that's going to be inversely related to the wet bulb temperature, right? So
Okay.
it's in there, and I bet that you could develop a relationship between the wet bulb temperature and the vapor pressure deficit and the air temperature. And just an aside, one of the hardest things was to calculate the natural wet bulb temperature from meteorological data. It turns out that most meteorological stations will only report relative humidity. To turn that into natural wet bulb temperature requires a very specific method. And we ran into this when we went to publish, because we thought, oh, we'll just do wet bulb temperature directly calculated from the meteorological stations. And the reviewer very correctly pointed out that the natural wet bulb temperature is a little bit different from regular wet bulb temperature. So we really had to go into the details. It's called the Liljegren method to calculate the natural wet bulb temperature. And it's a doable calculation. It just is a long equation. You just have to do it right. You can still use air temperature and relative humidity, just has to go through this more complicated algorithm. And then the Bowen ratio, the ratio of the sensible to latent heat flux. Yeah, you know what? I have wondered if a metric based on heat fluxes would be more accurate and require less of this arbitrary weighting than the wet bulb globe temperature. And we have estimates of the latent and sensible heat fluxes from the model, but we haven't yet tested that to see if those are more accurate predictors of the physiological stress. Because, this science is really only, 50 years old, right? And it was based on one set of experiments on US Army soldiers in North Carolina. And that one study, because it's so hard to replicate elsewhere, has been used as the standard for the globe. And I think there's a lot of room to explore alternative predictors like Bowen ratio. And again, as Jorge mentioned, maybe adjusting these percentage weightings on the wet bulb globe temperature metric. So yeah, thanks for that. And I think, your question points to the integration of the Earth system understanding, like land surface heat fluxes and human well-being. And I think that's our long-term goal, is to really try and unite the Earth science and the public health understandings, because I think we can get a lot further and with a lot more accuracy if we really combine those understandings. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. I have a question for you, Trent.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we talked a little bit about this before when we were together. I guess I think, like, over the last 50 years or whatever in the US in particular, a lot of these farms have become much, for lack of a better word, corporate or industrial. And they're not necessarily local farm owners who had it since, basically we stole California from Mexico. So my question is because you were kind of saying, well, you have these mayordomos and but there's not really a, like a local, so to speak, farm owner who's the, the guy you can go and knock on his door. And yeah, I mean, I guess you probably follow where I'm going with this. It just seems to me that they're so divorced, so to speak, and it's so many steps down to even get to the mayordomo, that I mean, I don't know. I would assume if you could actually pin it on a local farmer, it might actually be easier. But when you have to go up, God knows where the people actually own the farms are.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that a lot of the, in terms of like looking for who would be most justifiably held accountable, right, for the farmer well-being. I think it is difficult because the farm owners are often absentee. They might even live on the East Coast, or a lot of them live in San Diego. Some of them live directly on the farm, and we have a much better sense. And I've talked with a number of them. But they contract to these labor organizations, right? So the farmer does not have farm workers. The farm owner does not have like a list of farm workers, or doesn't maintain contact with farm workers. He maintains contact with the labor contracting organization. And so it's really the labor. I think if there was going to be a systematic change in the way that heat was monitored and enforced, it would be through the worker the worker contractors, right? So I think that's where the enforcement would have to come. And your point is very well taken, that us recognizing that it's up to these individual decision makers, how many of those people can you actually effectively contact and recruit into this? Because their careers are going to change. They also might move on to other jobs and stuff. So you're absolutely right that for this to have staying power, there needs to be a tie-in at a higher level of organization, and it would be through the labor contractor organizations.
Okay. All right. Do we have any more questions? ¿Algunas otras preguntas? ¿Dudas? Let's see. Okay. So any other general comments you want to make, Trent, about anything you wanted to mention, or?
No, I mean, this has been really exciting. I think that similar kinds of problems with farm worker heat stress are almost surely present throughout Mexico and Brazil. And I think to me, one of the main messages is that the farm workers can be empowered with smartphone apps that tell them what the wet bulb globe temperature is, and tell them if it's going to be too hot to work, tell them what they can do to adapt. And so, I think that's one of our take-home messages, is that really empowering from the bottom up is one of the most effective ways to go, while strategizing how to get more systematic and widespread adoption of heat metrics and regulations that are really protective of the farm workers.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much, Trent. Thanks for taking the time and giving us the talk. Hopefully we can keep advancing on our UNAM San Diego State interactions, also with Brazil too, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'd be happy, again, my background is in hydrology, but if there's interest in pursuing this work in any other part of Mexico or Brazil, I'd be more than happy to put you in touch with the public health workers who really are responsible for making a lot of the physiological measurements happen. And we have in-house global climate modeling expertise, and would be happy to collaborate on anything related to regional climate modeling. Yeah, I would love to continue collaborating and and making more connections. So please feel free to email me at any time.
Yeah, yeah. And anybody who wants Trent's email, you can send me one. I think everybody here knows me, and I can forward it to if you have other particular questions or interests. I don't know if it's on your page thing there. Oh, there it is right there. Okay, there you go. So it's in the chat there. It's in the chat.
I put it in the chat. I can also forward you these Google slides if you have a way to distribute them, and I can add my contact information in that.
Yeah. We can do that. We can do that.
Cool.
We can link it on the page there. All right.
Very cool. I wish
all right. Thanks, Trent. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Wish I could meet you all in person. Hopefully I will someday.
Yeah, we'll bring you down sometime. We'll bring you down.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for attending.
Right.
Nice to meet you.
Bye.